This guy will blow your mind. His life is a complete disaster. His dad kept him in the basement his whole life. And if that's not enough for you, the guy doesn't even have a name. Now the guy wants to get out of that asylum, find his mom, and then be a little happier with his kid. The story begins and we see a bloody, scary old wall covered in mold. Wooden furniture, chairs, and tables that are about to break, and the only grate we need to ventilate the room. Insects fly into this room from the outside using the ventilation. And after flying around the cold room surrounded by bricks, they don't even realize that one of the men is very jealous of them. And so in an instant, a hand is raised over such a bug, and then a clap is emitted, killing the fly. Afterward, the guy looks at his hand, seeing the corpse of the insect. At first, he just stares at it, as if forcing himself to do something. The guy disgustedly licks the corpse off his hand. Swallowing it, he exerts incredible strength. Still, the guy admits it was very bitter. The guy stands in the middle of this room under one lamp and just stays silent. The guy wipes his hands with a rag and then mentally says that he spent his whole life here. The only light bulb in the room goes out while the guy sits at his desk and writes something in his journal. Despite this, the guy continues the story, saying that he's going to escape someday. The guy is going to use the way of writing as a way of self-presentation. So he's doing it right now. Still, the guy's hands are starting to shake. The guy realizes that usually everyone starts their self-presentation by saying their name. The guy's face freezes and he stops writing, saying he can't do it because he's never been called a name. He doesn't know it. Still, the guy's gaze drifts to the corner of the table. We can see a picture frame that is definitely different from the surroundings. The guy explains to us that he must have one thing that everyone has. The picture shows a family holding a newborn baby in the middle of the woods. Based on his mental abilities, the boy assumes that they were separated from his mother right after the boy was born. Looking at the photo, the guy's face is still frozen. Because he's looking at a baby, the guy himself thinks the baby in the photo is him as a newborn. Looking at his smiling mother, the guy smiles as well, mentally telling us that maybe she loves him. But an ugly old man with glasses on a chain appears and assures the boy that his mother is dead. The old man continues to add oil to the fire, causing the guy to start panicking so much that his cheekbones crinkled with fear, and the pen fell out of his hand. Moreover, an old man with a double chin and a caustic smile continues to bully the guy, telling him the whole truth that she died right after his birth by jumping off a bridge. The old man keeps laughing as the guy continues to stare furiously at the old man, biting his lips and clutching his pen. By the way, the man standing next to his mother is his father, and at the same time he is to the guy the deranged bastard who locked him in this room. The guy obviously has no way to escape, because even if he escapes from this room and opens the huge metal door, he will meet many more of the same doors, which are located along the long corridor of the building. And all of these doors have locks. All the keys to those doors hang on the father's belt. With a smile, the father continues to taunt his son, telling him not to worry, for he will never send him outside. The man continued to stand over his son while placing a tray of cookies on his desk. The man asked his son if he had told him the reason why his mother had chosen to die by jumping off a bridge. The guy continued to respond with silence, at which point his father took one cookie from his tray and along with his face brought it sharply up to the guy's face, making him startle and shit himself with fear. A man with a serious face, holding a cookie in his hands, he said she was afraid. She was afraid of this world she lived in. The guy's eyes were filled with fear. Imagine there's a whole earth in the guy's father's hand. This is the earth. By smashing this earth, the father said that the boy's mother knew that the apocalypse was coming to this world. Spreading cookie crumbs on the floor, the boy only responded with a face that was filled with fear. The father kept looking at his son with an obsessed face. The father kept telling the boy that there was one reason why his father didn't send him outside. It was because he loved him. The boy's face continued to tremble with fear. His fist clenched at his father's words that he could not watch his son commit murder. The son claimed that his father was lying, which surprised the father enough. The son's trembling voice posed a question to the perplexed father, who asked him, Did she choose death because she was afraid of the apocalypse? The son's trembling voice was replaced by loud screams. The son ordered his father not to talk about his mom like that. The son continued to ask the father if he really thought the son would believe him. The son loudly pointed out the fact that his father had shut him down here and was lying about the apocalypse. Still, the father saw a diary that stood out from the other things on his son's desk. The father said it was his choice whether to believe his father or not. The father reached out and picked up the diary. The father lit the fire with a lighter and continued to stare fearfully at his son. Putting the lighter to the boy's diary, he stated that the text from this diary would never see the light of day. This made the son try to snatch the diary out of his hands. The guy reached for his father's hands, begging him to stop. Still, the boy was too slow, and so the fire reached the diary and began to burn brightly, incinerating the sheets of text about the boy. After that, the diary was lying in the urn the guy was sitting over. The guy's tears were spilling right over the urn. The guy kept shaking, and then the guy said loudly that a man like him had no right to be called a father. This made the father stand over his son and look down at him, smiling and spreading his hands. The father kept assuring the boy that he shouldn't say such things, for he was doing it for him. A face filled with fear heard the father's words that the time had come. The father invited his son to follow him. After a while, we could see creepy corridor walls. Along this corridor walked the father and son, who had earlier had a conflict. At the same hour, every day, they always passed through this corridor. Apart from the sounds of ventilation, there are no other sounds, much less the sounds of other living things. The boy, as he continued to walk down the huge corridor, was well aware that his father and he were the only living beings in this huge building. The creak of chalk. The father continues to write some information on the blackboard, while the son continues to tell us that he goes through the same routine every day. In the office, where my father continued to write something with chalk, there was only one blackboard, one desk with a chair, and of course a lamp which had already been signed for this asylum. The guy kept telling us, looking at the blackboard with a serious face, that every day the same lessons and the same trainings were held here. Still, pulling out the bottom drawer of the desk, the guy assured us that there was only one thing here that allowed him to escape the daily burnout routine. The guy smiled and then pulled out a book from under the desk, which looked more like a notebook. The boy remembered that in the short free time allotted by the daily schedule, he had time to borrow books from the basement library and read them. The boy also realized that there were many different books in the library, which was why he kept reading them. Most of all, he liked the book that described the world outside. The boy stretched his hand up and started looking at it, imagining how the sunlight that was described in the book could be felt. The guy, looking at the light bulb that is on the ceiling, put 2 fingers up to it. The boy's thoughts assured him that the light that was outside was much warmer than the light that was in their shelter. The boy, turning around, caught a hard trip. He found himself in the middle of a forest that was lit up by the sun. The guy started running through the grass, imagining what a beautiful experience of a peaceful day would feel like. The guy also wished that everything would always go according to a perfect scenario. The guy kept running through the busy forest with lots of people around. The boy imagined how he could look around and talk to people and become friends with them afterwards. But the most important thing that the boy must do immediately after the escape is, the boy woke up in the real world, where he immediately received a kick from his father. The desk and his son flew to the ground, but the book he was holding in his hand flew into his father's hands. Looking at his son's lying body, his father continued to talk to him, explaining that he had definitely told him that books were only allowed in his free time. The father held the book out in front of him and began to look at it. Naturally, the father realized that it was a book about what was happening outside. Smiling, the father mocked his son, stating that it was pathetic. The father's words made the boy continue to tremble and grind his teeth in anger. The father asked his son, does he really continue to believe in the tales told about the outside? The father continued to stare at his son's fallen body, pointing to the fact that he had told him before that he could never be outside. The son continued to lie on the floor, the father with a fearful face stating that when the apocalypse came, the world was filled with screams and blood, and only ashes were left at the end. The father continued to convince his son that his only way to survive was to stay living within the four walls in this shelter. The sound of teeth grinding continued to echo through the room. The boy was convinced that again, it was a lie. The smile on his father's face told him otherwise. After the father locked his son in a room, he always thought it was an absurd reason to lock him in a cage for life. The father also continued to mentally abuse him. Rising to his feet, the boy was convinced of one thing. Now was not the time for those thoughts. The boy's eyes lit up with a green light, a hopeful glow, so to speak, as he looked at his father's belt. The boy decided to wait for that moment, the moment his father would lose his defense. After that, the kid decided to steal his keys and get out of here. The events are transferred to the gym, a huge, empty, white-colored room with nothing else except the necessary things for training. The injured boy kept shaking, doing one push-up after another. His father claimed he only did 10 push-ups. It's not strange because there were a lot of weights on the guy's body, and they had different weights, which strained the guy quite a lot. Suddenly, the boy's muscle cramped, and then he himself fell to the ground, scattering metal pancakes all around him. The father continued to stare at his son with no emotion on his face. The boy was writhing in pain, holding his body with all his might so that it wouldn't fall again. At that moment, a father walks up to the guy, extending his hand to his son. The boy looks at the hand with great surprise. Silence fills the room, tensing the atmosphere a bit. The father does this without saying a single word, while the boy, extending his hand, turns away from his father and asks him why he is helping him. Taking his hand, the father immediately gives an answer to his son's question. The father pulls his son's arm towards him, and without changing his face, the father lifts his son up with all his might and then says that he did not say that he was going to help him. The son's body falls to the floor, for the father had tripped him up so that he would fall again. The tripping was so strong that the boy's body rolled into the mirror. The boy bumped into a mirror, which immediately shattered into pieces. The father kept looking at his son's body lying on the floor, the body of a guy who has been lying on the floor 1,000 times in this manhwa. The father gives a very important lesson to his son, saying that if someone lays a hand on the boy, he should never trust that person. The father looked at his son and continued to admonish him, explaining that the boy needed to be careful around people, especially during the apocalypse. Now all the metal pancakes and training dummies explained everything. The father kept telling his son that this was the reason why he was training him. The father gets into a fighting stance, stating that he will inevitably encounter other people. He must be strong enough to survive even with his bare hands. The father wanted to continue his instructions to his son, but looking at his son's body, which gave no sign of movement, the father realized that his son was not listening to him. The father called his son a weakling, for he still hadn't woken up from his blow. My father decided to call it a day, and so he started to leave. The keys on my father's belt began to make distinctive sounds. The green eyes lit up again, lighting the way to the keys. As he watched his father walk away, there was only one word in his mind: carelessness. The guy gets to his feet very quickly, grabbing the nearest shard that was left of the mirror. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The boy rushes towards his father as fast as he can. The boy was definitely waiting for his father to lose his sense of defense. Crouched down, the guy jumped up, saying he'd kill him in his careless state, and then he'd get the keys and he'd run away from this place. The guy's body came closer and closer to his father, the smile on the guy's face for so long beginning to show at that moment. The guy was convinced that it worked. The point from the mirror went straight for the experienced father's head. The guy swung and could kill his father in a second. The guy stopped time for a second, saying that in this plan, there was one little mistake. Though his father's face looked unemotional, it changed violently in an instant. The boy realized that his father was someone who never, ever let his guard down. So when there was a second left before his son would stab him with the blade, the father turned straight to his son with a Joker's grin. The father's body was very fast, and so the son attacking him with his blade unfortunately missed, receiving in return a very strong blow with his father's leg, which hit him right in the face. Day one before. There was the sound of water dropping. The boy's light blue eyes immediately opened. The boy started to run his eyes around the room, and then he saw that the sound of water came from the faucet, which after a while completely filled the water bucket. Finally, the father was glad that his son was finally awake. This made the son turn his head toward him in horror. Father, standing on the way out of the room, said that the attempt was a good one. Father, holding a glass blade, clarified that the attack he made with the blade was a good one. Still, the father continued to give his son lesson after lesson. With a smile, he raised the blade made of glass and stated that if he wasn't fighting with his bare hands, then there was no point in all the training they had gone through earlier. An even creepier smile appeared on the old man's face. Still, he decided to give him a fine for using the weapon. Namely, his son would train twice as hard, and the training would also be twice as difficult. The boy's body continued to tremble with fear, and afterwards the father closed the grate and began to leave, asking his son to rest a little. The father promised that tomorrow would be a very difficult day, and then laughed. The father turned off the light and then left to go about his business. After the father left the son's room, the son immediately made sure of it and then turned away, explaining that he knew of one thing that his father had not considered. While watching the air ventilation structure above his bed, he continued to explain to us that when his father turns off the light, all the electricity in the room goes out for a moment, and all the sound in the room just disappears. At this point, if the son can focus his hearing, then by going to the wall he can hear things he has never heard before. Things far from everything. The boy continued to listen to the extraneous sounds. He could hear the sounds of wheels coming from the street, the sounds of birds chirping, and the sounds of building different things in cities. From this, the guy realized one thing. Going further, the boy looks at the lamp, explaining to us that when his father says it's time to go to sleep, what he means is that it's night outside, in reality, and more specifically outside. It's time of day. And the other truth for the lad is the earth is a peaceful place. The guy remembered his father's words that the end is near, but the son still thinks it's just a lie to leave the guy right underground. Looking at the picture of their family, the son decided to get out and then find a way to find his mother. As he continued to look at the picture of his family, the son realized that whenever he asked his father about his mother, he always talked about her being dead, but in quotes. The boy, lying in bed, stated that he only knew about his father telling lies. The guy himself thinks there's a hidden meaning here. Clutching his blanket, the son began to emit a scary aura, stating that his mother was definitely alive. Still, covering himself with the blanket, the son decided to sleep, imagining that one day he would escape from this place and find his mother no matter what. Meanwhile, the guy's dad is walking down the halls, for some reason laughing as dumb as one can do. But at one point the old man's phone rang and his feet immediately stopped. Reaching for his phone, the old man pulled it out. Looking at the phone, he got a notification that a certain river was calling him. His face immediately changed, and after answering, father put the phone to his ear and asked what was wrong. He also pointed to the fact that he had already told me not to contact him for nothing, only if necessary. While the boy was sleeping peacefully, the father kept talking on the phone. Eventually, the sounds from the phone stopped, and the father asked the person on the other side of the phone to let him live. Afterwards, the phone fell to the ground, which is not strange because the guy's father started shaking from unknown things. While the father continued to tremble and shake from the tears that were coming out of his eyes, from the snot that filled his nose, his son wakes up. Opening his eyes, he hears the sounds of his father, who at one point began to laugh instead of continuing to cry from the grief that had happened. Opening his eyes, the guy realized that something had changed. Waking up, he asked what the hell happened. Trying to get up, the guy's body was unable to do so. Turning his head down, the guy found himself tied up. The son found himself in the very room where he and his father were practicing. The son started shouting to his father. What the hell was he doing? The son tried to ask the old man to untie him, but he only continued to make strange noises, which, judging by the sensations, one could not understand whether they belonged to regret or sadness. The boy, continuing to grind his teeth, realized that he was not being listened to. Then the son decided to agree with him and began to tense his body. He realized that with the help of his muscles, he could slowly break the ropes that bound him. He realized that he could use his muscles to slowly break the ropes that bound him. The guy smiled, though it was slow, but still the process was progressing. Alas, one thing only alerted our guy. It was the father who, with his scary face, appeared right in front of the lad's face. The dreadful tone ordered his son to stop. The order was so majestic that it felt like it pierced through the lad's body. The boy swallowed his saliva and then smiled and turned to his father, pointing to the fact that his father had previously said that training that day would be twice as difficult. The boy tried to ask if his father had forgotten that. The father answered with silence, and then he changed the situation by saying that the plans had been changed. The father pleased his son with the news that they would do nothing today, although still, the father decided to make one correction. No, not only today, now every damn day, his son would sit in that chair, tied up, unable to move. Those words made the boy sink into fear. The hopelessness made the boy start screaming and asking his father, "What the hell are you saying?" The guy tried to point out the fact that he had to train to survive the apocalypse because his father had already told him that before. But his father firmly stated that the training was now over. The boy continued to grind his teeth, moving from right to left in an attempt to untie himself, not realizing what had suddenly changed in his father. Now the boy couldn't do anything because he was tied up. The guy remembered his mom again, stating that he wanted to have at least one chance to see his mom. The boy continued to tense his muscles as his father stood over and asked the man, "What is he doing?" The son began to repeatedly put more effort, forcing the rope to tear not part of it, but fully one by one, freeing his body from its shackles. In response, the father only began to laugh, seeing his son's efforts. So creepy that, believe me, Slender Man is nowhere near it. In an instant, there was a huge burst of air that caught up with the guy. It was the father's punch that sent the guy flying off into the distance. Walking over to him, the father picked up the chair with his son again and asked if he had warned him not to move. Alas, the son smilingly continued trying to untie the ropes, but he was immediately kicked again. That didn't make the guy give up. He kept trying to untie his hands and feet. The guy, as if sensing the room, couldn't understand what had come over him. The glass of water continued to shake, and the boy realized that it would have been smarter to just pretend to agree with his father and look for another opportunity. But at that moment, for some reason, the boy didn't want to lose to his father. He wanted to keep fighting. His resentment towards his father, the one who locked him in the house and made him suffer, grew stronger and stronger. Finally, the boy's hands were untied, and the memories explained to us that when he was finally able to untie them, he felt a pleasure he had never felt before. The son became the father, the one who had always looked down on him. Turning around, the son began to smile directly into his father's face, the way he had smiled at him before. Still, the lad was ready to take the hit. The boy noticed one oddity during the fight. Besides his double ugly chin, besides his father being angry, the son realized that something was different. They were tears that the father had carefully hidden from his son. Behind the evil eyes, there was a deeply wounded soul man. Receiving the blow, the son couldn't understand why. Why was he looking at him that way? Afterward, the son received the blow, and the last thing he saw was his father expressing his hope that his son would understand. The lamp in the room is successfully turned on. The events are transferred to the room where the boy and his father were previously studying. Standing near the blackboard, the boy's father kept giving him one lesson after another as he sat at the desk. The boy's father kept asking him to always keep in his mind that among the survival tips he had taught him earlier, there was one that was the most important. The boy's father held a finger up, causing his son to start listening more attentively than before. The boy's father began his story titled, "The First Rule of Survival in the Apocalypse. Never, ever, ever leave the shelter." The boy's father drew this rule on the blackboard and began to say that there was no place in the world safer than their shelter. Imagine a lot of gears, hundreds of gears that have been working for 126 years. The boy's father tells him that in this shelter, there is also a place with plenty of food and all the necessary resources for existence. The son with a serious face continued to listen to his father, who by this time had already explained that trying to escape from this place, where one literally lives on whatever is available, would be equivalent to trying to exalt oneself by jumping into a bonfire. The boy's father finished his lecture by saying that the end comes to us without any warning, so the son must not leave the vault. The guy wakes up, remembering his father's words. The guy's cloudy gaze envelops the room, where the same guy finally rises to his feet in the middle of an empty room that has only white walls, bars, and white slabs on the floor to himself. And the guy finally tells us that when he wakes up, the father is gone, leaving his son behind. The boy's exhausted face looked around the room with shock, and not finding his father, the boy realized that this had never happened before. In the past, the boy's father had only disappeared at one moment. The boy could only see his father disappear when he was already lying in bed and then preparing for sleep. Only then could his father leave. The boy tensed up. He remembered the past events, the past fight with his father. The boy realized that when his father cried, he had acted very strangely. He realized that something was definitely wrong. The guy sat down on the floor and then he looked around the cage and looked around the room, listening to the noise of the mechanisms that had been working for 126 years. The boy felt that the situation in the asylum had changed strangely, for unlike the past lifestyle in it, now he could not understand anything. But there was one thing. He knew instinctively that something had changed. The sounds of machinery made it clear that something big was about to start. There was the sound of metal, and finally the boy realized that listening to his hunches was a good idea. Finally, the guy saw the open doors, which by some miracle the guy couldn't notice at first. The guy's eyes opened wide, and he felt that all the doors in the shelter had opened in front of him at the same moment. Finally, he felt freedom. The guy immediately got to his feet and started to run, because the guy realized that in his whole life, this was his first opportunity. Still, just by looking at the guy's face, you could understand a lot. The guy started running down the corridors, making distinctive sounds. He ran straight ahead without looking back. As he ran further down the corridors, the boy realized that earlier his father had stopped him from running away. But now, in no room, in no corridor, the boy realized that his father was not here. The guy kept running through the hallway. Finally, the guy took a sharp exhale of air from his lungs and then made a sharp stop with his feet. The tired guy stared at the staircase that is right in front of him. The guy kept looking upwards, apparently towards the exit of the shelter. Finally, the guy said, I found it. The guy, gritting his teeth, began to climb the stairs, continuing to move his hands from one step to another. He just begged the gods of the world that this was actually the way out. The guy, seeing the hatch, which apparently was also the exit from the shelter, hoped that after opening the door, he would finally see the sunlight. Finally, the guy slid the hatch aside, and immediately bright sunlight was directed into his eyes, which made him squeeze his eyes shut. Yeah, imagine if it was you. That's terrible. Finally, the guy got up outside and then stood on the pavement. The guy with his eyes closed started to gain courage, gradually opening his eyes. Afterward, the guy was so shocked by what he saw that his eye sockets were about to fall out and his jaw fell off. The guy saw the sun shining brightly in his eyes. Besides the sun, the guy could see a bunch of buildings, see cars, people, and traffic. The sounds of the cars and the sounds of conversations and all the rest of the beautiful picture of the city made the guy just stand silently and watch. The guy began to be surrounded by a beautiful picture of his city, where he could finally hear the city noise and the emission of gases enveloping the city. Guy continued to stand with his mouth open and mentally cheer. I did it! I really did it! At that moment, a middle-aged bald man appears behind the guy and beckons the guy over. The man got out of the car and started to call out to the guy. Approaching him from behind, he tried to ask him a question. What are you doing on the road? At that moment, the guy turned around. Stars lit up in his eyes and possession appeared. The guy exclaimed, "It's a man!" The guy continued to shock the average civilian with his surprise, namely that there was another person in front of him. The bald man with a puzzled face continued to stare at the guy, mentally wondering who the kid was and whether he had hit his head or something else. Still, at one point, the guy realized that now was not the time for such foolishness. He realized that it was too early to let his guard down. As he froze, he continued to ponder, realizing that his father had probably already noticed his disappearance, and he would probably go looking for him. Based on that, the guy immediately started running, realizing that now was the best time to get as far away from the shelter as possible. The loud sounds of the guy's footsteps resounded in the middle of the city. With a smile, he ran as far away from the shelter as possible. He had dreamed of this moment throughout his life, to escape from this place, from this shelter, and for the first time, to be free. But suddenly the guy's face changed. The guy's legs gradually stopped running. The guy froze and wondered, why? Why was the door open? The guy's face was getting cloudier and cloudier by the minute. The questions in his head started popping up like bubbles and then bursting. Was it a malfunction in the safety system? No, the door. The guy understood everything. The door had never been opened before, even if there was a malfunction. The guy realized that his father couldn't have made such a stupid mistake. The boy continued to ponder, and finally he speculated, what if opening the doors to the asylum was his father's plan, who was now chuckling snidely, watching his son being read like a book? Still, the lad found that hard to believe. He assured himself that it was impossible. The guy's eyes glazed over. He realized that he was the one who made it a rule to never leave their own shelter. Still, the guy turns around, seeing people quietly spending their time in the coffee shop, smiling as two guys and two girls go home, discussing everyday boring topics, like a grandson reaching for the balloon in his grandfather's hands in the presence of his parents. The guy keeps looking at all the people who are smiling, just smiling, doing everyday things. Afterwards, the kids start running, rushing after each other, playing catch-up. The guy, however, kept looking at them, his eyes wide open. The boy calmed down, finally smiling, noticing that he understood something. The boy watched as one of the boys was able to transfer the status of someone who runs after others to the girl who ran ahead of him, letting go of the balloon. The boy realized that his father was lying. It's all very clear here, outside the vault. Pigeons continued to fly around the city. People were peacefully discussing what was happening in the world. The balloon was flying deeper and deeper into the sky, and people were taking one sip of hot drinks after another. The guy watching the balloon, which went straight into space, realized that, as one would expect, the approaching apocalypse did not make any sense. But something began to happen. The earth began to shake and people began to tremble. The world began to literally collapse before our eyes. The end comes without any warning. Strangely, the pigeons began to gather in a huge pile in the sky, and people couldn't take their eyes off the sky. From the balloon, behind which some strange object began to appear. The huge semblance of the planet overshadowed the sun, and then all the people froze watching it. A huge sphere began to loom over the planet, which approached the planet Earth and began to pass its tentacles closer and closer to the Earth. The needle-like tentacles began to intertwine with each other, and then, having passed through the sky, began to approach directly to people. People looking at the sky realized that it was coming, while others could not understand what was in that world. They were aware enough to realize that the planet in front of them was clearly not the moon. Still, people, instead of running away, they preferred to just admire it and take pictures of it with their phone. He didn't understand what moon they were talking about and what they were talking about. The guy understood one thing, that people do not see what is right in front of their eyes. One of the tentacles was getting closer and closer to the ground, and seeing this tentacle up close, the guy could realize that it was a huge monster that was going to kill our hero. Although, how can I put it? There's not just one monster. There are hordes of them, and they're running like a wave, preventing each other from squeezing through. In these huge tentacles, monsters like a wave, and then these tentacles began to twist and get closer and closer to the ground. The boy recalls his father's words, "Never leave the shelter. It's a basic rule that guarantees survival. But there is still one exception, if an enemy enters the vault, which is what a lot of monsters are doing now. Or if a dangerous moment comes, the one rule no longer applies. At that moment, a remote command is sent to the vault, which makes the doors close, and logically no more monsters can penetrate deeper. The people looked up at the monsters that were now gathered around them. Worms, millipedes, and all sorts of nasty, ugly monsters were going to kill every living thing, humanity, that there was on the planet. People continued to watch the monster without making a single step, but at one point the monster grabbed an office worker. The office worker in turn started screaming furiously, "Siren head, ahem!" The monster brought the poor worker to his head and then opened its mouth, throwing all the other observers into an even deeper shock. The man's glasses shattered, and then half of his body flew in the other direction. The civilians didn't understand what was happening at first, but after realizing it, their faces suddenly changed. People in cold sweat and with tears in their eyes immediately started running away screaming and asking each other questions related to this event. In the middle of the crowd, a guy started to stand out who was completely immersed in the music, not hearing what was going on outside. At first, the guy looked around and killed all the monsters. Okay, just kidding. He looked around and opened his mouth at what he saw. Immediately, a huge rock flew at the guy, destroying everything around him. There was also a monster on that rock that took the guy down. The monster threw out a stone after a while, and then one by one the stones started flying into the crowd of fleeing frightened people. A monster with 2 blades instead of hands appeared on top of the fleeing people. The monster rushed towards the people in an instant and then cut through the crowd of fleeing people. Watching people being torn apart one by monsters, people flee in fear and then let out loud screams. The guy's eyes freeze, and hearing people asking each other to call the police makes him shiver even more. The boy heard a huge explosion behind him and then opened his mouth wide. The boy began to stare at the approaching Death Star and then remembered that when his father told him that the apocalypse would come, the world would be filled only with blood and tears of sadness. The guy continued to watch, realizing that after all the people died, all that would be left were piles of ashes. And those people who were having fun earlier would end up losing their lives in the blink of an eye. The guy's gaze froze very much. A huge monster appeared in front of him, which was taller than the others by 1,000 times. He began to destroy buildings like a man kills an ant, and therefore people who were watching him began to scream in fear. It was clear the world had been destroyed, so the apocalypse had begun. This is day 0. During the attack of hordes of monsters, they demolished many buildings and killed people. In the middle of all this chaos lay our hero, who again remembered the advice of his father and realized that his father was right. So the guy remembered one more words of his father. "Your mother is dead." The boy got to his feet and started walking forward, in the midst of all the chaos and people who were running away from each other. The boy didn't understand. Was his father really right? A lot of monsters continued their attack, starting to grab people in their hands and then devour them using their jaws. The wave gradually moved on, killing one person after another, but suddenly someone grabbed the guy's arm and pulled him towards him, and then behind him. It turned out to be the guy's father, who kept running despite the fact that his son was about to die of surprise. The boy screamed and asked his father, "How is this possible?" Many people ran on, but the boy's father did not give a clear answer. He only asked the boy to run without stopping the movement of his foot. One of the civilians tried to run away from the many monsters, but at one point the monsters still caught up with him and took the poor man with their numbers. The boy looked around in fear, and after seeing his father turn the corner, he immediately rushed after him. But alas, the boy found that there were monsters where his father had turned the corner. Then the father, at the same moment, leaned on the nearest railing and then jumped over it, calling his son after him. In this case, the guy continued to run after his father. To the surprise of many people, ran from the point to which our heroes ran. So looking back, many people were amazed at this turn of events. Monsters pierced, grabbed, ate people, but the heroes still continued to run where the father moved. The other residents tried to reason with the heroes, but alas, they were also attacked by other monsters from the other side. In the end, the only survivors were the father and son, who ran for all their strength. The guy had the strength to look back and see how a large cluster of monsters like water accumulated and imprisoned the bodies of people. In this case, the guy realized that at this rate the monsters would catch up with them, so he shouted it to his father. The father rudely told him to shut up and just run. The father then shouted loudly that there was only one way to escape from the city, and now they were going to realize it. After a while, the father and son climbed the bridge, where the son kept looking back and shouted to his father that the monsters had already climbed the bridge. But suddenly the boy's body stopped and his eyes froze with fear. It turned out to be a monster, which was one of the first to climb the bridge with the help of its sticky tentacles, and then grabbed the hero. The monster's tentacles squeezed the guy's leg, and he began to squirm in pain. The pumped-up body of the guy began to tremble from pain and from fear, because he realized that if he could not get free from these tentacles, he would soon be finished off by other monsters that would be on their way. The father lifted a huge stone with his strong 2 hands right above the monster, and then with a sharp movement, he was able to cut off the tentacle that was gripping his son's leg. The monster started crying loudly in pain, and then the monster fell off the bridge because of the pain. The boy continued to sit and groan in pain, holding his leg from the tentacle's impact, while his father looked down at him. The boy had a scar on his leg that would remind him of the event in the future. The boy heard the noise of the monsters, so he immediately flinched. The boy's father looks much more prepared for this, as he shows no emotion at all. The monsters continued to rush through the city, crossing one freeway and then another, destroying every car and person in their path. The monsters climbed the bridge and afterwards started moving even faster, trying to catch up with our 2 heroes. The guy was getting to his feet, but his body kept shaking. The guy's face was writhing in pain. He realized that he had to get up and then run forward. But there was one problem. The guy continued to run forward at a much slower pace. With every second of sprinting across the bridge, he promised that the more he ran, the more he realized. The guy began to look around and realized that the distance between him and the monster was shrinking very quickly. Suddenly, the guy's knee started shooting painfully, and the guy realized that it didn't make any difference how he ran. Because of the pain in his knee, the guy immediately fell down, and then started rolling forward on the asphalt, still writhing in pain. The guy's trembling face made us realize that he couldn't run away from here. When he looked up, he saw his father, who was once again looking down at him. The boy was silent and then began to tell his father quietly to go away, for he would not be able to escape in his condition. The boy assured his father that he should run alone, without him. The guy's father's leg went up, and the son started looking at his father's back, noting that everything is just like before. Everything is right. His father is just running away. The guy remembers his whole life, how he stayed in the asylum behind bars all the time, and how the guy's face changed from desperate to very angry and tearful. The boy's father constantly walked away from him, leaving him alone and constantly ignoring his son. The boy's gaze finally sank into sad memories, and his eyes began to grow more and more cloudy. Another thing happened that threw the guy into an even deeper shock. I think you can tell by the shadow on the ground. The guy's father crouched down and held out his hand to his son again, and asked him why he wasn't getting up. The boy just looked at that hand and didn't understand what was going on. The boy started shouting furiously and asking his father, why does he have to ask him again? Why doesn't his son run away? The boy continued to shout violently, turning to his father and explaining that he had already said that even if he ran, he would not be able to run far enough. The father responded by saying that his son could survive, all because he had a plan. The boy's face remained unchanged from shock. He wondered, what? The boy said with a note of sarcasm. No way. You have a plan. But seeing his father's serious face that still hadn't changed, the boy decided to pull himself together, and remembering his father's tears, he finally gave his hand to his father. But the guy's father did the same thing again. He threw him over to the other side and then told him to start running. The guy immediately started running. Looking back, he tried to recognize his father. Did he really have a plan? The boy also looked at his hand and noticed that he had a strange piece of paper in his hand. The father kept shouting after his son that he had no time, and now he just had to get away from the bridge. The boy looked back and shouted that he understood, so he started running as fast as he could. The guy continued to run forward with all his might. After a while, he covered a great distance. He ran through many cars, and finally, at the last breath, he crossed the bridge. After all the events, the guy looked back sharply as he saw the bridge begin to gradually collapse. Eventually, the guy's eyes literally started to tingle as the bridge began to collapse faster and faster. Eventually, the whole bridge literally broke like a cookie, and then the bridge fell into the abyss. The boy looked at the collapsed bridge, all alone. Only heavy sighs could be heard from the person standing next to him, who wasn't even there. The guy couldn't believe what he saw. All he did was wonder what happened to the bridge and why it collapsed. Afterwards, the guy finally realized what had happened. This was the plan that his father had talked about earlier, stating that he had a plan. Standing on the edge, he kept realizing it, and afterwards wondering why. Why did his father go along with this? The son couldn't understand why he did this if his father had previously tortured him throughout his life. The guy's body kept shaking, and he didn't understand why it had happened to him. The guy was sitting right on the cliff, realizing that he had survived after all. But now, what's the guy gonna do now? The guy remembered reading books, spending time, but now he couldn't understand what he was living for. The guy remembers putting his hand up to the light bulb and thinking that all he wanted was to get out and start living on the land above. The very hope he saw in the sunlight. Gone. The boy realizes that many died in this city, in the very beautiful, peaceful life. The ruined buildings told him that everything was ruined. At the sound of the burning fire, the boy remembers that very picture of his family, and then he remembers his mother, his only target. The boy starts shaking even more, saying what he wanted to ask. Why did his father go so far away to save him? The boy remembers his father reaching out his hand and then grasping it tightly, handing the strange paper into his hands. Now the boy kept clutching the paper in his hands. The boy started to look at his fist, which had a small paper with notes on it. In addition to the tears in the guy's eyes, there was also hope. At that moment, one of the monsters landed near the sitting guy. The guy naturally noticed it right away, so he pointed his gaze straight at it, finding that it was a monster that looked something like a sandman. The guy gets scared of the monster and immediately starts running away from it, but then his knee starts hurting again, and so the guy, writhing in pain, grabs a splinter from the bridge that was previously collapsed. The monster is too fast, so the guy tries to jump over it. At one point, the guy and the monster jump over this bridge. The guy falls and rolls across the battlefield. The monster also did not calculate his strength, so he continues to roll. Finally, the guy stopped rolling, so he diligently started trying to get back on his feet. Alas, the guy realized he couldn't get back on his feet. Looking at the monster, the guy realized that his stamina is as low as possible. The monster at this point starts to rise, and the guy gradually realizes that there is no way to escape from this monster. The guy starts to strain the atmosphere, assuming that he's going to die right here and right now. Hope faded, but the boy realized one thing. He believed he had nothing else. The boy unclenched his fist in which he held the paper tightly. When he saw what was written on the paper, he started to sob, and the paper started to get wetter and wetter with every second. The tears continued to fall one by one, and despair continued to report on the boy's face. There was still an inscription on the paper, apparently written by his father. "Your mother is alive." The trembling boy couldn't understand why his father would say something like that to him at a time like this. The monster finally rose to his feet and stood right in front of the lying guy, but the guy was filled with something new. So he immediately rose to his feet and with tears in his eyes said that now he wanted to start living. The guy didn't want to give up. He wanted to do everything he could to survive and find his mom. But looking at the monster's face, which lit up and prepared to attack, the story changes the time of the narrative and moves to the past, where the father again teaches his son a lesson, saying that when the apocalypse comes, it will be impossible for people to survive. Since they wouldn't have the strength or knowledge to survive on their own, The boy continued to cry while the monster came closer and closer to him with every possible second. Yet the guy's father in that line of narration kept saying that even if they eventually survived, it would be very difficult for them to adapt to the conditions of survival, because every day they would face danger. The monster continued to prepare to attack, and the guy became more and more frightened of the incoming attack. Still, at the time, the boy asked, "What if he was in danger of death? What then? Does that mean I can't do anything? Do I have to accept my death?" Still, the father of the guy at first just kept silent in response to this question, while the monster's fist was getting closer and closer to the guy. And at the last moment, a realization came to the boy. The father appeared behind his son, and then he asked his son, "Have you forgotten everything I taught you?" At that moment, the boy's mind began a trip in which he began to remember all the moves he had learned before. He finally managed to jump back and dodge the blow the monster gave him. The guy was able to jump back far enough for the monster to slip far enough after the attack. After a while, the smoke cleared and a guy appeared in the same spot who clearly looked tired enough from his attacks. The monster looked around and then looked at the guy, clearly showing him that he was going to attack. The boy became afraid again, and then remembered his father's words that his son was different from other people. The biggest difference between him and other people is that he understands how he can survive. The boy runs his eyes across the battlefield and finds a strange object that has been stuck in the ground. Still, the guy was trembling at first, and then began to pull himself together and finally did it and got into a fighting stance without picking up the object from the floor. At this time, the monster continued to run at the guy, who finally changed his gaze. Everything his father had told him about, the monster attacked the guy, but the guy used a roll-up in an instant and was able to dodge the monster's attack. In an instant, the guy stopped his roll and latched onto an object that was stuck in the ground, turning his body. The guy continued to run forward and the monster continued to stand motionless. The monster turned around in an instant, and the guy was able to jump up high enough. And then, taking his object in his hands, he swung and delivered a crushing blow to the monster's head, piercing it through and causing the monster to crumble. Events are transferred to the depths of the city, where in addition to the monsters and debris of buildings, there is one place where all the people who managed to escape hid. Now on their faces, instead of smiling, there was sadness. One of the survivors with a long gray hair told the people around that it's been 4 hours and the cops are still not there. But one of the survivors kept pointing out that they were very lucky to be able to hide here. But now they are starting to run out of food, so they need to get out and get more food. Silence fills the room, and then one of the men decides to lighten the mood by asking if anyone feels the need to speak. One of the girls wants to object, saying that if they wait a little longer, something might happen. The girl is interrupted by another guy, asking her to stop talking now. Scratching the back of his head, the man states that she makes other people feel uncomfortable. Still, the girl asks the question again, trying to find out why. She also points out the fact that she doesn't speak loudly. Still, the guy makes a facepalm. By the way, it's interesting that this girl was sitting next to a man who didn't have half of his body anymore. Still, the man tries to make everyone around him forget, and after taking a step forward, he tells everyone around him that he might go crazy at this moment. This immediately causes a girl in a school uniform, yellow hair and bangs that cover her face, who is just observing from behind a wall, to turn to the man. At first, the girl apologizes to the man for decency, and afterwards asks if he really checked the surroundings. Still, the guy affirmed the girl's words, assuring her that they couldn't find food in that wreckage anyway. This caused the young girl to take a deep breath. The man also addresses the girl again, saying that if they want to stay here and survive, they will have to somehow find food to live on. The girl responds to the man's words with silence at first, and then assures him that there is one place they still haven't checked. The girl points her finger to another place and says that she has not checked there before. So she asks the man not to give up and not to make such a sad face. This makes the man smile and then thank the girl, immediately putting her in a stupor with her words. The guy goes on to explain that everyone here is very tired of what happened. They barely survived the process of escaping from the monsters. The man thanks the girl, as she is the only one who wants to help everyone. The man also assures the girl that she is actually a good child. The man was very happy at the girl's words, so he clenched his fist and expressed his hope that they would continue to hope that everyone who was here now would eventually survive. The events are transferred to another location, where a girl appeared in front of two guys. As she approached, she tried to find out if they had found any food in this place. The guys at first just looked at each other, and then took out a bag of food, saying that they had found it here a little earlier. The girl was very happy, but not for long, because the guy decided to open his bag of food. The girl was very happy, but not for long, because the guy decided to open his bag of food. The girl started to shout indignantly, asking what they were doing, because earlier they had said that they would share with everyone what they found here. The guy with red hair assured the girl that it was discouraging, for people make their own decisions. The guy kept telling the girl that they had never said that they would follow the flock of sheep. The girl started to get angry, saying that yesterday they had eaten from the common portion, which was shared among all the people in the shelter. Then the bald guy looked away and asked, "Are you sure we did that? I don't remember that." The girl started to get angry and gritted her teeth, saying that if it was true, she would report them to all the other survivors. At that moment, the bald guy made a scary face and stood up from his seat, making the girl's face change and scaring the guy. The bald guy continued to intimidate the girl, kneading her neck. He suggested she go and try to tell her friends everything. The guys asked the girl if she really thought they would just sit there and watch her leak the information. Then the girl swallowed her saliva and afterward immediately said that it was pointless. The girl assured the boys that they would not be able to catch her, for she was sure of one thing: she was very fast in distance running. The guys immediately made scary faces, so they started moving towards it. But at that moment, a huge monster made a sound and made the guys turn around and start shaking with fear. The guys started talking to each other. The bald guy turned to his friend and started talking to him, clarifying if they really heard the scream now. The red-haired guy confirmed that he definitely heard it too. But still, the guy with red hair assured the bald man that it was a long way from here, so he thinks it's all good. The bald man finally relaxed, and then he turned his head and saw the yellow-haired heroine sitting there trembling with fear. The bald guy started laughing fiercely at the girl, asking her where the confidence she was showing just a minute ago had gone. The guy continued to intimidate the girl, saying that she was nothing like a mosquito. The bald guy also pointed out that he didn't want to see her run away using her shaky little legs. Still, the girl at one point froze. She saw the food that was hidden behind the rubble. Time passes, where our favorite good guy turns around. He notices that the girl with yellow hair has returned, and so he asks if she looked in that location. The girl holding her hands in her pockets says that yes, she looked there, and yet the guy asks what the bottom line is. The girl clutches the paper pie that is in her pocket. A gurgle sound comes out of the girl's stomach, and then the girl assures the good guy that she didn't find anything. Then the good guy starts to declare that everything is fine. He is more happy about the fact that she survived, for the more they live, the more food they can find. During this, a huge frog-like monster appears behind the survivor. It jumps in and kills one of the survivors. The girl is thrown off by the blast wave, so she starts shaking, and then she sees the scary picture and opens her mouth as wide as possible. She sees the monster climbing on the good guy. The good guy starts to reach out to the girl. The good guy was shaking with fear and inspiring fear with his gaze at the same time. The good guy started begging the trembling girl to save him. The girl immediately started running, screaming that she was sorry. The guy started pulling his arm and asking why she was doing that. Still, the girl bared her teeth and then started yelling that she was not a good person. Still, the girl was able to run away after hearing her good friend screaming. At this time, the two friends take their feet as far away from the shelter as possible, and the bald guy only asks his red-haired friend not to look back. The bald guy also notices that the girl with yellow hair is running ahead of them, and the red-haired guy warns his friend that it is all right, for if she is caught, she will act more as bait, and then they can run to the other side and survive. The guy with the red hair starts smiling furiously and mentally says, "What an idiot, she's running straight toward the monster." The monster attacks the girl. She notices it right away. After the monster attacks, she starts to run very fast, and her bangs finally fall back. She jumps and a star lights up in her eyes. The girl jumps straight up and dodges all the attacks the monster makes. She continues tumbling forward, dodging one attack after another. Afterward, the girl rises up on her hands, shocking the two bastards. Finally, the beauty appears before us in full glory. Get likes, 500 likes in a new installment. See you sometime tomorrow.